because because we're going to be hearing today from a new member of our faculty, as well as the journalism faculty. When Kjerstin visited the Annenberg School last year, last year, to interview for a position in public relations, we spoke, and I was delighted to detect in her all of the signs of a communications scholar with an interest in public opinion, and quickly tendered my offer for a portion of Kjerstin should she join the faculty, and she did, and my offer was accepted. So we are a proud owner of a portion of Professor Thorson's attention and teaching, and that's particularly relevant because she will be teaching a graduate course in public opinion, something that we have long wanted to have among our offerings. So it really is a great pleasure to welcome her to the School of Communication as well as the School of Journalism, and to hear her talk today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to meet you guys. I was just saying, Larry, that there are a darn lot of people here, so I'm really excited to get to know some of you today. And I have to apologize because I did a little bait and switch. I replaced what was kind of, I thought, a cool title with a much crappier title, but I did that for reasons of my own that I will keep to myself. But so live with it. You're going to hear this particular presentation. And what I want to talk to you about, the main body of the research I do is actually kind of focused on this question down here. Right? How do we think through possibilities for mobilization and engagement, particularly among younger citizens, in the context of the sort of changing media ecology? But the stuff I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of the top two questions. And the reason for that is when I was working on this part, I got kind of frustrated with the tools, like the thinking tools, not the full-on my own brain, but the sort of equipment that I was using to make sense of a lot of these questions, right? Because I'm a kind of classically media effects person, right? So what you're going to see here, and this is fresh, this is ongoing, this is stuff that's not done in this sort of ink on paper kind of final sense of the word. What you're going to see here are two stories really that kind of reflect my journey to try to broaden the thinking about how we can ask questions about the context for use of the engagement of public opinion. So the first story I'm going to tell you is about the first question, which is how can we try to think systematically about the way young people make sense of their own citizenship? And if we do a good job of doing that, or at least we do some job of doing that, well, it tells us something about how different young people are differently resourced to take advantage of some of the cool ways to get involved in public life. And then the second question, the second story that I'm going to tell you has to do with civic norms, which is something, a question I'm really interested in. Is sort of a sort of hard and fast, measurable and survey data kind of way to think about what citizenship looks like in your head, what the set of beliefs about being civic are inside your head. And what I want to argue is that, at least in this case that I'm going to talk to you about, which is about getting informed and how we feel like we need to get informed under what circumstances, that the norm for doing so kind of sets up a certain set of expectations that the environment that we live in, especially for young people, increasingly doesn't really provide you with the best kind of opportunity structures to get the job done. Okay, so I'll make a little argument about that. The place I always start, where really all my questions come from, is what happens when we go from this, right, to this, right? Which is, I don't need to belabor this. You've heard of the internet, I'm assuming, and probably mobile phones and blogging and things like that. There's a lot of questions you can ask here, right? I myself ask questions about credibility, about messaging, about where did that mass audience go? Where do we find our people? How do we activate and mobilize, and what are some of the ramifications for all this stuff for civic engagement? But the problem is, and this frustrates me, as somebody with a PhD in something called mass communications, right? Increasingly antiquated sounding, if I studied mass communication, what would I do? It's not what I do. So it frustrates me because I want everything I do to be about this, right? But of course, in reality, this stuff and these changes, these shifts in media ecology live in some really broader sort of society-level trends that I think, and I'm going to argue to you, right, that are really important for us to understand. And we can sort of debate to the extent of which they are happening, right? But really important sort of bigger trends that help us ask better questions about what's going on with our media ecology. Let me just give you a couple slides of that background. I'm drawing on a bunch of like really big people here, right? Big sociologists in particular. I'm totally going to gloss on this, so I apologize. But in general, the argument is that late modern society is characterized by the erosion of influence of the sort of traditional and modern institutions that for a long time kind of organized our lives, right? In which we were pretty solidly embedded. And all sorts of big societal trends, things like the transformation of labor towards really increased economic insecurity, it's sort of an instability, sort of global level. The disintegration of traditional family structures, which, by the way, disintegration sounds like a bad word, but you know, there's some positive things here too. And also, most importantly for the argument I'm going to make today, declining group memberships. Young people in particular have been part of a really mass de-identification with traditional political institutions. Some kind of interesting ways. And that includes political parties, but also nation states in some cases, states in some cases, and also civic associations, or sort of geographically co-located people hanging out together associations of the kind that Robert Putnam writes about, right? All right, so this is like the big picture thing. What does that feel like? What does it feel like to grow up in that, right? How can we get at the heart of what does that feel like, right? Well, Ulrich Beck has this really important argument about what he calls the process of individualization, that we're all part of, right? And it goes a little like this, right? Part one, right? Living in late modern society is the decline of the taken for granted life path, right? That would have been me, right? Pie, I can't cook. Well, I can cook. I can't make a pie, right? My husband's not that dapper, right? But for the most part, right, you get the picture here. The decline of the taken for granted life path. To some extent, the choices that you make for your life are less determined by the place that you find yourself, right? I mean place kind of broadly. So that's nice, right? Woohoo, for me not having to just bake pies. However, it has a nasty, sad side. Individualization, the sad part of that is that even though our life paths are no longer taken for granted, we are required to make our own life biography, right? We are required to constantly be figuring out and refiguring out some sort of life path for ourselves, right? How do we do that? Well, unfortunately, we do that by, and you know, if you sort of, I find this very resonant kind of in my own life, right? We do that by making a series of really difficult, uncertain choices by consulting a profusion of experts in the absence of some sort of overarching authority, right? In a lot of different domains, whether it's, you know, you think about the medical domain, right? You go to the hospital, you go to the doctor says, you've got disease X. You don't go home and go, oh, honey, I've got disease X. I'll just do what the doctor says, right? You Google it, and you look it up, and you talk to people, and you join support groups, and you try to figure all this stuff out for yourself, only to find nobody knows. Right? That there isn't necessarily one right way to go. So you have to kind of make your choice, commit to your choice under these circumstances. Right? We can also choose, or we think we can choose, among sort of a whole bunch of different patterns of ways to live our own lives. And all of this stuff, right, the struggles and the uncertainty and the choices and the experts, all of this stuff is sort of on display through this media ecology. Right, so that's the background. So let me start by telling you how I think this relates to public engagement, to civic engagement. I think we tend to spend a lot of time getting really excited about the opportunities that are out there for people to get involved in politics as individuals, right? We're pretty psyched about that. We're pretty jazzed about that. This is really, and I seriously, if there were like a nerd store here, we should make T-shirts that say DIY citizenship, right? This is the decade of do-it-yourself. You see it all the time, right? Start your own tea party, start your own this, give your own money. There's a lot of these sort of tools online that allow us to take advantage of really sort of proliferating possibilities for getting involved in public life. However, and this is the dark side, the sad part is, right, that what I'm finding is that not all young people are equally well resourced to take advantage of these opportunities, right? And I don't mean resource, you know, in the sort of classic socioeconomic status, although that's so true, right? I'm talking about sort of breadth of thinking resources that we have to work through our own sense of our place in the world, right? And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. I've intentionally made this a very methodologically light presentation. There's this slide, and then there's another slide. So if you want to talk about methods later, I would love to do that. Suffice it to say, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some interviews, the latter half of which were very, very long, sort of in-depth interviews with a bunch of different young people, talking with them about everything, really. You know, TV, hanging out, high school, life, whatever, and sort of culminating in these conversations about citizenship. Why would you talk to people about citizenship, right? I actually asked myself that. It's certainly in the middle of the interviews. It turns out when people talk about citizenship, it's awkward and backtracky and contradictory and messy, right? It's not coherent in the sense that you sit down to breakfast and you're like, I'm a civic Republican, right? We don't think like that. We don't think about citizenship, right? So it kind of makes sense that we have this sort of messy, unorganized pool of things in our head for talking about citizenship, right? But it turns out that I think it's really important because the things that you have inside your head to help you work through thinking about public engagement are the bridges, right? They allow you to build bridges between sort of what's private and personal and self-interested and what's public and even political, including helping you define what stuff belongs inside of each of those domains. They are sets of resources inside your head that come from out there, right? In ways, and I'm not going to talk so much about this part of the work that I'm doing, but they come in sort of interesting, systematic, patterned ways based on stuff we already know about, right? If you picture a person inside a Venn diagram. When you do this is clearly a PowerPoint slide you should have made, right? Okay, but picture for me, right? You're inside a Venn diagram, right? That carves us out in kind of interesting ways, right? We're carved out by our demographics. We're carved out by the sort of important spheres of socialization, things like what the particular media diet is, your peers, your family, your schools, and things like that, right? And the out there stuff that you're exposed to shapes the set of resources that you have inside your head for talking about what it means to be a citizen, right? What your obligations are, what it means to be public. So I call this thing a citizenship vocabulary. And I like this metaphor because it reflects both that the stuff, the set of words that you know in a language, right? Like I speak sort of perhaps French, right? I speak, pretty decent English, although I did just say crappy. And it also reflects the sort of the breadth of all the concepts that are in a language, right? All of the possible resources for thinking through things that you have available to you. And what I'm finding, right, and what I'm becoming persuaded of, is that for those who have broad repertoire of ways of thinking through citizenship, they have more flexibility, more resources to draw upon in a time where whether or not and what kind of a citizen you want to be is becoming a matter of choice rather than a matter of routine, right? Rather than sort of a institutionally, I don't really care about the thing, but I go to the thing because that's what my dad did. We don't have that as much anymore. Okay? So therefore, citizenship fluency becomes sort of an important resource variable. So what I'm trying to do, and I'm very open to making this better, I'm trying to map citizenship vocabularies, right? And when I say map, I want to understand how people are different in terms of the footprint they take up on this space. And the way I've divvied up this space has to do with some work in sort of citizenship theory, thinking about what is a citizen, right? One part, belonging, right? What do you belong to? To what community or communities do you feel you have a sense of belonging? And then also, right, involvement. What are the ranges and the possibilities and the repertoires for the ways that you can see yourself acting in the world? And so my argument is that it's out of sort of the way your vocabulary takes up space here, and the way these two poles are entangled with each other, right, that helps explain how you define the kinds of things you do. Let me make this more concrete with blobs, right? So think of vocabulary as blobs on a map, right, taking up space. This is, I'm just going to give you a couple of my favorite examples. This is Kelly, a really lovely young woman who would hate to be reduced to a blob on a map, but there she is. Okay, Kelly is famous to me as the student body president, right? Campaigned for, elected student body president who's not political, right? Not political, not into politics. And this is quite common, right? For those of you who've worked with high school students for whom men oftentimes have a very rich career in service, right? A very rich career in service and sort of community level volunteering that are sort of constantly defining themselves out of the political, right? Something that we would call sort of political institutions. And it turns out, when we talk through her ideas about citizenship, she very much defines herself, deploys her really rich ways of talking about how she can act in the world in a very local way, right? So she'll talk about something that sounds like political consumption, right? Political consumption, like, I don't buy that can of tuna because it would hurt someone somewhere. She'll talk about something like that, but she means buy local. She'll talk about how important it is for somebody to get informed, but what she means is know what's going on with your own family, right? That's the sort of defining your membership, even down here at this sort of hyper-local level where your obligations are so narrow that it's more to your family. You don't see yourself as an actor in the broader world. In contrast, these broken blobs are Jonathan, who you would love, right? I mean, I'm sure there's Jonathans in this room. He's the, the super thoughtful, I care. Every decision I make in my life has an impact on the world, right? That person? You don't have to tell me if you are that person, but we can hang out at school. So Jonathan, though, has this really interesting, and his blogs are separated because he thinks of himself as a global citizen. He'll talk about himself as a member of the world, right? But he really has no affiliation, no sense of sort of thinking through any sort of spaces in between here. And the way he wants to act is at the hyperlocal level, right? He'll say things like, my personal decisions, or I'll be kind to the people in my life. I will sort of act as I should act. And his blobs are sort of over to the left here, primarily because he doesn't do the stuff that we normally associate with activism, right? The old school kind of activism where we we get together and we can touch each other and we do stuff and we get to know each other. We sort of, create something together. However, I think this is really important. He doesn't think of himself as acting alone. Despite that what he's doing are very individual acts, things like being careful about what he buys. He thinks he's part of a community of people acting in concert, okay? Not in concert in the sense that we've all made a decision, but that there's some sort of imagined community of sort of changers out there, right? Which is why it's sort of located in the middle. All right, so why does this matter? It matters because in the absence of routine, sort of institutional things that draw us into public life, right? For example, civic associations in the sort of most classic form. This stuff, right, your blobs, your citizenship vocabulary, makes a bigger difference, right? Because there's a more direct route between your sort of resources for thinking through what it means to be public and what it means to be out there in the world and what you may actually decide to do, right? So for the people who are motivated and have this sort of broad repertoire of ways to think through their actions, they are actually really empowered, right? This is like the most kick-ass time to be alive. I mean, it's in many ways it's a horrible time to be alive, but if you want to change something, you want to do it on your own, you want to go make something and have your voice be heard, good thing you're alive, right? But for people whose motivations are not that strong, right, the resources here become really important. So hold on to that for a minute. Let me tell you the second story. The second story is different. What I'm kind of trying to do is make a sort of a case of a couple of different civic norms. Right, almost a case study of a civic norm. And this is the one I call the trouble with political knowledge. This story begins with our belief in the idea of the informed citizen, right? I'm guessing that most of you think that knowing something about politics is kind of a good idea. Probably a pretty good guess. And of course I agree, and there's lots of good evidence to suggest that political knowledge, even as sort of classically mentioned in terms of facts and figures, is really important for spurring participation, for making good decisions, for having sort of constrained set of ideologies and knowing what's going on in the world. However, those of you who have not read Michael Schutzen's really good book called The Good Citizen might be surprised to find out that this informed that citizen idea is actually a 20th century invention, right? This is new. This is new. The expectations for citizens in 1875 were not the same as the expectations for citizens now, right? Which is really interesting. And what Michael Schützen does is he writes this sort of interesting history of citizenship to show us how the sort of ideals and models for the way to be a good citizen shift over time and in the context of history, right? However, he argues, I'm totally persuaded by this, having been out and about looking at stuff about citizenship, that this informed citizen model remains dominant, right, into the 21st century. What is the informed citizen model? Well, it's one part, you need to be a sober, responsible consumer of news, right? You need to be an autonomous, thoughtful processor of that information in order to come up with your own opinions, right? Something we could sum up as making up your own mind. So the problem with that is, and this is not a new problem, that everything, well, most everything we know about how people figure stuff out, about how people learn and about political knowledge, tells us that to a great extent, political knowledge is not a private thing, right? It's a social enterprise in a bunch of different ways. We are not autonomous citizens making up our own minds by ourselves. We also talk to people, right? We learn stuff in conversation. Having different conversations shapes our opinions. And also, and this is most important for here, we have sort of shortcuts in our head based on the way we're embedded in different kinds of institutions, particularly political parties, that help us make sense of the crazy, right? I want you to close your eyes. Actually, don't close your eyes, that would be weird, right? But mentally close your eyes and think about what it would be like to read a news story without some sense of partisanship, right? Not even that you have it and hold it, but that you don't, it's not even a thing for you, right? Without some sort of other complex schema for understanding the way the world works. That's the stuff that makes it easy for us to understand the information as it goes in. So how's the context for the civic norm around information changed, right? I've been, in another part of this project, I've been using a bunch of data from 1965, and a survey of high school seniors in 1965. High school seniors in 1965, 70% of them read the newspaper 3 days a week. 70% of them! That's crazy town, right? 70%, right? 70-ish% of them watched the nightly news. That's crazy, right? 17-year-olds. It just seems goofy to me now, right? But then, that was a time of information scarcity, not in the sense of how much of it we used, right? Because actually, it was very routine to be exposed to the system of mass news media, right? You know this, right? But in terms of how much information was out there and how authoritative it was a simpler time, right? You could end a newscast and be like, that's the way it is, and not look like a goofball, right? So at the same time as the sort of media news ecology was in some ways sort of tidier, there was also more strong guidance from institutions that help you understand your place in the political world, right? This is the time where it was actually not impossible to take someone's basic demographic facts and have a pretty good shot at understanding their vote choice. That's not the case anymore, right? That's not the case anymore. A lot of this is happening because of this sort of societal level disintegration of a lot of these institutions. All right, so fast forward till now, right? We're at a time of information abundance, which is awesome, right? But let us say that right now. I'm not against stuff that you know. It's awesome. It's amazing. And I'm going to show you how amazing it is in a second, right? But it's also a time where that information doesn't come with a good housekeeping seal of approval. Bar the information that comes in the good housekeeping. The rest of it does not come with that sense of authority, particularly for younger citizens who really deeply mistrust a lot of stuff about the news media. Okay. Also, right, in addition to information abundance, we have very weak guidance, right? So this de-identification with partisanship and with the kinds of community, family, lifelong this and that sort of institutions that made things seem tidier, right? So it's kind of a double whammy. So what does that mean? I'm going to tell you two narratives from coming from the interviews, just because I'm kind of in love with them both, just to give you a flavor for what this feels like. And then I'm going to show you how we can use more quantitative methodologies to actually kind of test some of this and see how it actually looks in numbers. Right. This is Sam, really cool guy. He's a sophomore now. Talked to him last year. And I was asking him, right, do you think you'll vote now that you're 18? And this is the classic answer. Over and over and over again. I would if I knew enough. I would if I knew enough. I would if I were qualified. And the informed citizen model has been used for a good solid 100 and some years now to exclude, before formally, right, the actual knowledge test before you could vote, and now much more informally, right, is a way to sort of, comes out like this, making people feel like they're not qualified to participate. So of course the question is, well, Sam, how would you, go about getting informed? No, I'd go online. Okay, you go online. Where would you go? Because we've already talked about where he gets his news, and it's primarily from his MSN homepage, so where would you go? Right? And then, well, I'd search for the issues. Okay, all right. How would you know that you had a good source in front of you? And then you get into this really thoughtful conversations about the beliefs about the strategicness of how messages are formed, right? And I'm sure you've heard this either in your own life or from your students, right? In the end, you hit this sort of autonomy thing, right? This like autonomy jargon. You just gotta know. You just gotta figure it out yourself, right? And he's persuasive, right? I hear this candidate saying, "Oh, this candidate hates babies," and it's like, does he really? How do you trust this guy? Because he's just trying to win an election. And then I'll believe it. Oh my God, he hates babies. And then he'll come back and be like, I don't hate babies. Just because I this, he hates babies, but that saves billions of jobs. Who are you supposed to believe, right? I heard this from Ivy League grads too, right? People going, oh, this one woman who, just a really amazing woman with a kind of also a really cool, rich career in service, saying, after the oil spill, I thought, I really care about animals. I'm going to go down and see if I can clean off some birds. So she's like, all right, what can I, that's cool, right? Go clean off birds. And then she said, well, I started looking into it. And, it turns out that the last time we cleaned off birds, we actually only saved 1 out of every 10 birds. And then I read somewhere else that actually, it costs X number to clean birds. And then if you look at it on a per bird basis, it's actually worthwhile, right? And of course, that's the complexities of the world we live in. But it's paralyzing, right? In some sense, it's kind of paralyzing. So poor Sam, right? He's like, I have these great conversations through life history when people tell me about their lives and all the cool stuff they do. And then you get to this end part and they're like, oh, right? She's really pushing me on how I use the media. It's kind of difficult, right? So he doesn't even have partisanship to rely on. He doesn't get it, right? Not only does he not get it, and I heard this a bunch of times, he thinks it's kind of like a mindless tool. It's a shortcut for fools. They're not always right. But what this results in is he's setting himself up for an effort, like a big effort, right? To carefully evaluate each candidate against each other. Tricky, right? To carefully evaluate somebody's economic plan against somebody else's when you're 18. Tricky, right? And by the end of the conversation, it's quite clear to both of us that this isn't going to happen, right? But I want you to understand this is not like Sam's a stupid idiot, because he's not. He's a smart kid. But the challenges that are set up and sort of mismatch between what the expectations of the informed citizen are and the opportunity context to become one, it's kind of tricky. I want to show you, though, the flip side of this, right? With all this stuff, there's an awesome upside cuddled up with the kind of unfortunate downside. Does anyone know who this is?
Bear Grylls.
Bear Grylls. Bless your heart. Does anyone else? Let's have a show of hands. Who knew that was Bear Grylls? 1, 2. All right, good for you. Good for you for wasting at least some of your time. Okay, so this is Bear Grylls, and Bear Grylls has he's a former British agent. Yeah, Grylls, Grylls, right?
Welsh.
Is that Welsh? Okay, so Bear Grylls is a former British Secret Service guy, and he has this show on the Discovery Channel called Man vs. Wild, right? Oh, now you know who Bear Grylls is, right? So for those of you who don't know, the way the show goes is, here's Bear Grylls armed only with his wits and I don't know, a piece of rope or something, and they take him in a helicopter and they drop him down in some sort of profoundly inhospitable environment, right?
With a camera crew.
With a camera, good point. With a camera crew and probably somebody who keeps him from dying, but unknown, right? And he makes his way through. It's a classic autonomous, it's man versus wild. So the flip side of this unfortunate stuff about the late modern getting to know stuff environment, the good news is that there is Nicholas, who is the Bear Grylls of information seeking, right? There are probably also Nicholases in this room. Nicholas has the same sort of autonomy jargon that Sam does, right? A lot of, you just gotta figure it out for yourself, except he figures it out for himself, right? And I show you this because I think as a room full of what I'm pretty sure is some pretty elite information processors, I think it's easy to forget how much effort we put into knowing stuff, right? So he's like, I don't like mainstream media. No offense. Who likes mainstream media, right? Okay. No, I know you do. All right. So you know, he's like, I don't like mainstream media. It's too filtered. You hear this all the time. But I was like, well, what do you do with it? How do you work it out? He does. He has spent hours and hours over years since the time he was in college and this became his passion, right? A passion-driven sort of participation where he reads 40 or 50 news sites, he curates them in a really interesting and cool way. He compares versions of how different stories were reported across news sites. Awesome, right? He's like, what do you call those? Like he's like a journalist, right? He's like somebody who figures stuff out, right? He's carefully figuring stuff out. And this is a process that and I like this term that Gibbons calls reskilling, right? It's something that is allowed to happen because of the openness, right? The freedom-y part of being in late modern society, which is the part where you don't just have to do something because you're a woman. You don't just have to do something because of X, Y, Z. You can kind of re-empower yourself to take on these really cool skill sets, but it's hard. So this sets us up with like who's up, Sam or Nicholas, right? Who's winning? What's the better way to characterize this population of people? Although you kind of wouldn't know it from all of the interview data I've been using, I'm more of a quantitative researcher, right? So an interest for me is how can we turn some of this into numbers? How can we really see this and aggregate some of these processes happening? Are they happening? How can we test them, right? This is the other method slide. And I'm sorry, I'm happy to talk more about it if anyone wants to, but I was part of two big data collections around the 2008 election. One, a panel survey of adults nationwide, and the other, a really interesting parent-child dyad, right? So based on a sample of kids aged 12 to 17 and their parents, and I was able to add sort of a bunch of questions about these ideas of citizenship and civic norms, those are those. So what are we looking for, right? If I'm right, or Michael Schützen is right, that the informed citizen norm remains dominant, right, in terms of a shared set of beliefs, then we shouldn't see any difference between cohorts, right, in terms of how much they would endorse the knowledge norm. I said that it would be no surprise to you to find that there are no differences, significant or substantive, between cohorts on how much they endorse this norm. Right? The question was asked, a bunch of different questions. In order to be a good citizen, do you think you should be knowledgeable about political issues? I'm just going to focus on this one question. Right? Across the board, yeah, pretty much, generally, yes, and everybody at the exact same rate. Okay? So what's the next question? What's really interesting to me is, can we see change happening under the surface? Can we see under the surface of, yeah, we should all know what's going on. Can we see under the surface starting to emerge this spread, right, between what you expected yourself to do and the possibilities that you see for yourself to do it? And I think we can, right? We can see it by looking at the relationship, the tightness of the link between what you say you want to do, I think it's important to be a knowledgeable citizen, and what you actually do, right? Which in this case is actual knowledge, measured as a test of actual candidate knowledge, right? So if I'm right, we should see a weaker relationship between endorsing the norm, which we all do, and actually knowing stuff among the .NET cohort, the youngest cohort of citizens. And in fact, that's exactly what you do see, right? And you see it, again, among the 12 to 17-year-olds, right? So it's nice to have a little convergence of evidence here, right? Just to be clear, what that suggests, right, is that there's a weaker relationship between thinking the norm is a good idea and actually knowing stuff among these younger citizens. So of course, yeah.
Could it in principle, could it also be there's less information available? The
yes.
time cost to get actual information is increased, so only those who have a driven norm will seek the information.
Yes, exactly. I think that is one of the possibilities. So what are the other possibilities, right? Let's pretend that we think this is the way the world works, right? That you endorse the norm, which should motivate some sort of information-seeking behavior, right? which should then have some sort of outcome in actual knowledge. That would be nice, right? I would like to live in that world. Many of you probably do live in that world. Right? And these icons all sort of represent categories of variables, ranging from sort of soft news to conservative voice media, online media, including sort of aggregators, print media, liberal media, including liberal blogs, and broadcast news. Okay. So in a perfect world, we would expect that if you endorse the knowledge norm, you would turn to one or more of these sources, you would learn something, and then you would know something, right? So what are the possibilities for young people? Where's the break in the chain, right? Why is the knowledge norm less sort of predictive of actually knowing something for younger people than for older people? Well, one possibility is they're lazy. They're not willing to invest the time. They're not willing to go out there. They're not willing to try, right? That seems kind of possible, right? And this is the other possibility. Okay? The possibility that they go out and they seek information, but they don't learn. That they're not learning, whether it's because they don't have the sort of mental organization, whether it's because they're not choosing the right sources, whether it's the media literature, all the sort of various reasons that I'm trying to talk you through. Okay. So we can do this. We can actually model this in the context of a path analysis, looking at this, plus also this, but looking at this and controlling for things like age and education and gender and race, things that could be sort of entangling up with those sets of relationships, right? And I sort of did that. I've done it in both the CCAP data and future voters data to compare across these different age groups to see how these relationships are different. Right? For the boomers and the dutifuls and the Gen X's, we get something that looks like this, right? You know, in statistical world, this is a decent approximation of the way we think the world should work. We can have a whole conversation about this if you want, but it turns out that for older groups, less so for the Gen X's, but for older groups for whom mass media use is more routine, right? More the usual, it's what I do. Endorsing the knowledge norm, right? The more you endorse the knowledge norm, the more it actually spurs a very specific kind of information seeking. And in this case, that's partisan media, and that's online media, right? Online news and information. Okay? So that's good, right? Endorse the norm, you go seek the knowledge. In this case, this may shock none of you. The only one of those that you actually learn from in this case, right? Turns out to be sort of online news, and that includes things like the New York Times online, right? So for the most part, except for the aggregators that are in there, it's mostly the online versions of sort of traditional news media organization. Right? So how about our .nets? Right? It turns out that both in the CCAP data and in the future voter study, so it's exactly the same when you look at the 12 to 17-year-olds, we see just like, right, and actually in a couple cases even stronger than some of their older colleagues, or like colleagues, whatever you call them, the knowledge norm does in fact spur trying to get more informed. And they're not even using conservative media, right? They're going to liberal media and they're going to online. But nothing happens. There's no relationship between information seeking spurred by that knowledge norm and then actual knowledge that comes in the end, right? Which means the world looks a little bit more like this than it does like this. All right, so I'll almost finish up now.
What are the absolute levels of
Oh, the absolute levels of knowledge, a little bit lower for the .nets. Decent. This was like November, right before the actual election, like the end of October. They were, I'll pull up the version, but lower for .nets, but significantly, but not, I would say, hugely so. Yeah.
What about the age factor? I mean, are we sure that the boomers, when they were age 12 to 17, were as engaged? I mean, we have kids in that age range, and they haven't kind of grown into the idea yet that they would want to seek this type of knowledge.
Yes, and that's the ultimate question, right? Until your children get old, I cannot fully tell you that, but I will tell you the data that I mentioned earlier that I'm using is a panel study of high school seniors from 1965 through to 1997, and they asked, political science study, there's not a lot of media questions on it, but they asked the coolest question. The first question they asked was, what do you think it means to be a citizen? Open-ended question. And we have all these responses. So I can't tell you exactly about what's going to happen to your kids or mine, But I can tell you that these kinds of things do not grow over the lifetime, right? So what you looked like in 1965 is actually a pretty decent predictor of what you look like later in life. So I don't know, right? I mean, we can't definitively rule out the possibility that, you know, these kids will grow up to be like old people, right? But I think there's enough changes, right? Enough of these sort of big picture, widespread changes that gives us good reason to think that at least some of these processes are going to turn this cohort out somewhat different. Okay, right. So mismatch between expectations of the informed citizen and the sort of structures or the context in which those can be met. And I'll tell you, just as an aside, I have another norm case that I'm not going to talk about where the opposite is the case, where the norm, and this is the norm to be sort of self-expressive of your values, the norm is actually a much stronger predictor of action among young people. Right? So it's not like civic norms are going to hell. That's not the argument. The argument is that some civic norms work better given the sort of context in which they have to be actualized than other norms do. So the kind of takeaway argument I want to make from this is that, first of all, I think we spend a lot of, and I do this myself, we spend a lot of effort and energy getting really excited about some of the new ways that young people are getting involved. And I think we do that in part because there's been this like hammering awfulness of these decline stories, right? Like, we don't go to civic studies, we bowl alone, we don't read, we don't do anything, nobody cares, right? And I think we've sort of kind of gone back in the other direction a little bit. We need to understand how, in various ways, different young people are differently resources to take advantage of the kinds of opportunities provided through forms of media that are offered to them. And then finally, and we can talk about some of the rest of this project that I've been working on, if you so desire. But some of the stuff I'm not talking to you about today is, how do we predict this idea of citizenship fluency, right? Where does it come from? Where do we get these resources, even these sort of motivational resources in order to have that sort of flexibility and ability to take advantage of what's going on in the world? And then finally, and I know this is something that a bunch of you are working on as well, how can we help Sam simplify his task, right? How can we, and does our understanding of what the problem is help us think about ways that we can simplify that task? All right, so thank you so much for listening. If there's any questions I can answer, or actually if you also want to introduce yourself, that would be awesome. Okay.
Yeah, so one of the differences, it seems to me, sort of generationally or across time, that relates to that is in the earlier periods, 1965, and these really ancient periods you're talking about, being informed required scheduling. So it had to be routine.
Yeah.
You say you read the paper every day. You watch the news, at certain times. So if you had the routine, or if you absorbed the norm and followed it, it would also become part of a routine. It seems to me that one of the things today that should figure in here is that the routine is no longer necessary, and you have a kind of, like what they call in industry, just-in-time manufacturing. I mean, you have a set that if I need to know that, I can find out right away. I can open it up and I'll have the answer. So in a way, it's not necessarily so much a matter of sort of acquiring it on an ongoing basis because I've absorbed the norm that I need to do that in case I later need to know it. Like, just in case someone asks me the question, I will have been following it. I don't know the answer. What I have now is, I know how to find it if I need it.
Yeah, you know how to find it.
Because apparently Sam doesn't.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting question, because in a way it could be, all right, all you need to know, it's like not needing to memorize formulas, but knowing how to generate them if you need them.
Yeah.
It's like, it goes back to my formative moment in the second grade when I was told that the teacher wouldn't suffer if I didn't know how to do long division later on in life, but she didn't know the calculators would be invented. And I still don't know how to do it, but I know how to find out. So to what extent is there a sense of learning the just-in-time part?
Yeah, I think that's true. And the problem, though, with the just-in-time part is the reason you can look stuff up and understand really quickly is because you've got all this stuff in your head already that helps you make sense of the stuff that you read, right? I mean, this process has been really enlightening, both because mostly I work with numbers, and numbers are not, they're complicated in their own ways, but they're not, and messy in the same sort of way as like reality is. But the thing to keep in mind here is, and I think it's so hard to understand what it's like to not have these elite information processing skills, right? And I'm not sure this is just media literacy. It's sort of the institutional literacy that comes up with growing up partisan or growing up as sort of part of something.
I'm just curious on your media outlets that you showed. I didn't see radio, and I was curious, especially with the boomers and the older talk radio, etc. Was that by choice not to include radio?
Yes, it was. I mean, this icon thing here comes from a big factor analysis of both these data sets have really detailed media use measures to the point where we know if you listen to NPR and how often you listen to conservative radio or not, right? So the problem is that those variables didn't load up very well with any of these. So yeah, it was intentional.
Okay.
I was wondering, for 2012, with the dot generation, do you think do you have reason to believe if lack of knowledge is stabilized, or it will continue to go down, or might go back up? What would your thinking?
I don't know.
To speculate.
I mean, I guess, so 2008 to me was like the year of the kiddo, right? I mean, all of my students at least were really jazzed up about the election in a way that I think was a little surprising and new and interesting. But the knowledge levels were still kind of low. And one thing I'm not talking about here, but one sort of important ramification of this sort of lack of civic institutions, lack of sort of routine pattern ways of getting involved in politics, is that you also don't have necessarily that level of commitment, right? Which I think we saw with the sort of abandonment of Barack Obama, and a really profound disappointment where I'm going, you can't fix the world in 20 minutes, right? And people are going, what? You can fix the world in 20 minutes. So I'm not entirely persuaded that you would see knowledge go up until either we sort of start to rethink what it means to be knowledgeable, right? What does that mean to be knowledgeable? Or we rethink how we give information.
I would just predict it would go down because with more information, facts are harder to find.
Yeah.
It costs more.
No, I think you're exactly right.
Find relevant facts.
So one of the things, and I'm interested in your discussion of Kjerstin's use of the informed citizen model as dominant, but at the end of this book he talks about the emergence of the monitorial citizen. And what I'm hearing more is the monitorial citizen with individuals seeking information as it applies to them. And I'm wondering...
In terms of practice, but you will never hear that in terms of the norm given, right? So when you ask people about, what are you supposed to do with information, they will give you, I'm supposed to follow the mass media and I'm supposed to make up my mind about, broadly speaking, about politics, right? Because I think you're exactly right, that underneath the surface of that norm, the model for how we actually engage in the world is changing. And it's actually the disconnect between that and the sort of dominance of the way we think we're supposed to be involved in the world that I think is causing some of the problems. Does that make sense? Yeah, because I think you're exactly right. Yeah.
A lot of the literature in political socialization looks at what's happening in family life, for instance. And fewer children are having a family dinner hour, which is in these formative years a really critical place for the transformation of political information as well as political partisanship, political values. And we know that if you can hook partisanship, then you can drive the information gathering and you can drive the interest later. So I'm wondering the degree to which that may be one of the changed conditions, and particularly given that was a place where families sometimes literally watched the news together.
Yes.
And you had that sort of distillation of information to political values that was occurring over a pot roast.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. As the sort of key spheres of socialization being, well, now we add media, but peers, family, and schools, right? Sort of, institutions that play a really important role, right? And I think you're right that you can actually see the sort of drift of what we used to think of like a transmission model of socialization. It's kind of going by the wayside in more of a sort of tangled, like, well, maybe I socialize you, kind of, back and forth sort of a way. However, at the core, I guess, hooking partisanship, I'm not sure it's the right thing, right? And partly is because I don't think that kids are stupid for not wanting to be partisan, right? And again, it's really hard. I'm a partisan, right? Really hard to take that away from myself for a moment. But when you think about a lot of the issues that they care about, right? Environmental issues, big global issues, or what Beck talks about as sort of like the big global risk kind of issues, they're not necessarily perfectly cut along partisan lines in ways that I think make sense, right? And so I guess for me, the question is less how can we get partisanship back in there, and more how can we, and I think communication scholars in particular, how can we think about reinstitutionalizing, right? What are the new institutions that will help us organize our knowledge, right? Like when John Gaskell was here a few weeks ago, talking about how you publicize citizen deliberation. If you institutionalize that, that becomes a really important source of helpful information, shortcuts, right, to help you decide. Because it's either that, right, or it's, political celebrity right now. Yeah.
It's interesting that we're talking about the decline of institutions and the media and partisan parties, and the education system didn't seem to come up. It seems to me that the first place you start are the high schools and the colleges teaching these kids how to read.
Yeah.
And I use myself as an example. I feel that if you had given me this test these different times, my information seeking now is probably lower than it was,
yeah.
but my knowledge would be higher because I know how to read now.
Yes.
And I didn't really learn that
yeah.
in college. You
yeah.
learn to get a gist and a sense, but it's not the same as saying, wait, this sentence, does this make sense? This is a lie. You can tell a lie at 37 years old in a way that at 24, I couldn't.
You can sniff it out.
Yeah, because you had experience and you're taught
sure.
how, and at least in my education, they weren't taught that there's an agenda. This is how you read. A proper argument looks like this. If it doesn't look like this, it's probably deception.
Yep.
And we don't teach that, and they got to learn it, and maybe it takes 15 years of life experience. So I just feel like somewhere in here, isn't the public or private, however,
yeah.
education system?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, working in schools is not what I do, so I don't want to overspeak of it. But I've actually looking at a lot of the sort of programs that have been designed to go into schools and get people to learn stuff. And I think one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I think if we don't understand what the problems are with how we learn stuff, the programs tend to be, here's a newspaper, read the newspaper. No, seriously, I'll put you in the news, read the newspaper. Oftentimes, right? Which makes sense, right? Because if you're in the newspaper industry, you're worried about that. We have a lot of beliefs about, sort of in general, hook 'em young on media, hook 'em young on the TV news, hook 'em young on whatever. You're not going to hook them if it doesn't make sense, right? And I think you're exactly right, that we need to take this kind of stuff and go back and look at curriculum again. So I think that's exactly right.
I would agree that it all comes down to the whole why should I care thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because I did a master's thesis on the informedness factor among college students comparing Germany and America. And that was like pre-internet.
Yeah.
So, and the Germans came way ahead, and what it came down to was these students in California, it was, why should I care? I mean, I'm busy studying nursing, I'm busy studying this. They had a vague sense, but the Germans, obviously coming from a smaller country, had a much stronger sense that what happens in the world is going to affect my life. Mm-hmm. And I think it definitely goes back to, the idea of this monetized society that we live in. Their own parents are so busy, we're all busy doing our jobs and we're focusing on the immediate thing, and so no one's talking to them about the bigger picture, and it's not taught in the school. And in particular in America compared to other systems, from what I've seen, it's sort of you hone in on your thing and you do it well, and maybe if you're lucky you'll have a little bit of a view of what's going on around here, but they need to care. And I think that's where kind of the nugget of it is. I
think that's true. They do need to care, and I think part of what we think of when you mean care is you mean sort of having these vocabularies that address the nation state is something you belong to, right? And I think it's really interesting to see how many young people, no one will tell you they're not a good citizen, right? Everyone will tell you, I'm a good citizen, I open doors for people, or I'm friendly,
but everyone
I
will
pick
tell you,
up
I'm
litter.
not political, I'm not political.
Right,
yeah.
Sure, exactly. But and it's not just lip service, and I think it was for a while, but it's really kind of profound alienation from, I think, feeling an obligation to that level of society. Because, so that makes why should I care? They care a lot. I'm not showing you these numbers. This cohort of citizens cares more deeply about the environment, about education, about helping the less fortunate than we've seen in any cohort in a long time, right? But what they don't have is that sort of sense, the sort of routine, like, I go to the association, and the association goes, how about we fix this thing? And you go, I would like to fix this. Let's have it. But the sort of rhythms of the ways that people have been drawn into public life are kind of withering, right? So I think that's really good.
I think the point you just made is really interesting because you're talking about sustained activation versus kind of one-time activation.
Yeah, that's true.
Sustainable activation, perhaps. Have you seen an example?
Jerry always names everything very, very. If you ever need a name for something, I would suggest among his many skills that you would go to Jerry. Yeah.
And that'll cost you.
It'll cost you. It'll cost you dear.
And now, of course, now I've forgotten the question. Have you seen an example of what you could consider sustainable engagement or activation? And if so, what was the secret sauce?
I don't know that I have a real good example. I mean, I think both the Obama campaign and even the recent protests in Wisconsin, which is where I came from.
But those are like one time. There's no evidence yet that they're going to be
Well,
sustained.
that's the thing, right? I mean, so what have these people had the opportunity to do? I would say in general, no, right? This is the tricky thing about the social media, social network society is that we all become sort of always at the ready, right? I mean, I bet in this room, if we wanted to throw a protest for like, anti-popcorn crumbs over there, we could probably muster a whole lot of people really quickly to do so, right? But this environment, I think you're right, doesn't provide that sort of sustained commitment that, I don't need to go all, if you guys have read that Malcolm Gladwell piece. I don't mean to sound like that because I don't think it is like that, but in the sense that we all need to, that we know each other and not only that we have sort of like touching relationships, but that we have the ability to create some sort of shared frame of reference, right? Which I think is kind of what you use to sustain collective action. So no, I don't have a good example of that. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Next week, David Serlin from UCSD will talk about mediated sexual health in the YouTube era. Same topic, really.